Welcome to this episode of The Art of Marketing Science, the podcast that looks at the subtle and sometimes not so subtle art of bringing great scientific innovations to life and also bringing them to market. I'm Julian Stubbs, here together with my co-host and sometimes friend, Dr. Robert England.
Hello again.
And Rob, so this week we're going to call the episode KABOOM. Okay, we know why. As we'll be looking at the life of another great scientist, Alfred Nobel. Now, Nobel was the inventor of dynamite and founder of the prestigious Nobel Prizes. So this episode is, as you say, a real banger.
Oh, wow, that's a good one.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll also be looking at global life science hubs. And we're starting with Alfred's hometown of Stockholm, Sweden, and Dr. Robert's hometown of Uppsala, Sweden.
That's right, but actually Uppsala is a city because it has, not a town, it has a cathedral, and therefore it is a city. Small, but it is a city. But the first thing I want to say to you, Julian, it has to be said, congrats on Liverpool winning the Premiership. You must be a happy man. I'm actually surprised you're not wearing red.
Well, you know, as they say, cut me and I bleed Liverpool red. But anyway, yes, and it was a wonderful moment. I've been sort of basking in the afterglow of winning it for the past couple of weeks or so. And it feels really special because it's the first time we've won it at Anfield since actually 1990.
Well,
so a real achievement.
Very good. And I'm sure, on a Liverpool-related note, I'm glad you've now explained in our last episode the origins of your use of my name, Dr. Robert, that you've named me as. It was a Beatles song, of course, and they were from Liverpool, naturally.
Of course, the great city of Liverpool. And it was indeed. And unlike the Beatles, Dr. Robert, you've not supplied me with any amphetamines or drug.
Not yet.
All I get is a good cup of tea, which actually is my kind of drug, anyway. So, the discussion about Liverpool is relevant to this week's episode, as I've been lucky enough to work with the city of Liverpool on a few occasions, and the city is a great place and has undergone a transformative turnaround in the last 20, 30 years or so. And the marketing and branding of places is a subject very close to my heart. So we wanted to focus on it as applicable to places of science. So science spaces, or science hubs, as we would say. Now, I've been fortunate to have worked with a whole bunch of different municipalities, cities, airports, and even countries in the past. And places like Liverpool, Hamburg, Stockholm, Basel. And you and I have worked with a bunch of science hubs, so we have pretty good knowledge of them. But to kick off, let's start with our hometowns of Stockholm and Uppsala in Sweden.
Great. Now, I live in the wonderful city of Uppsala, which, despite its small size of just over 200,000 people, it's Sweden's fourth city. Maybe unknown to many is that it's a life science hub. It's probably started with the Swedish biologist Carl Linnaeus, also known as Carl von Linné, who did his work on the taxonomy of plants from the 1740s onwards. But we're going to be talking about that later. And you, Julian, you're a Stockholm boy, right?
Very, very much a Stockholm boy. And Stockholm is a place I love and I've been intimately involved with. I was the one who developed the whole Stockholm, capital of Scandinavia brand positioning. The Danes have never forgotten it. I'm a hated figure in Copenhagen, basically. And that branding has been in place now for 20 years or more. And life science is obviously one of the really key industries here for sure. And as we said at the start, in keeping with our earlier podcast, we'll be exploring the life of another great scientist who's become world famous. We'll be looking at the life of Alfred Nobel, basically, a man who made his fortune blowing stuff up and then tried to redeem himself with medals and money. But first, let's kick off with some discussions around place marketing in general. Now, places very much compete for inward investment, tourism, events, and even population and residential growth. And all places compete, and being successful can determine really whether a place grows and brings more jobs and skills development. It also helps drive upskilling of the local workforce. often leading to training programs and partnerships with universities or colleges. It drives economic growth and diversification, helps inject capital, growing local businesses, and diversifying the economic base of a place. Now, cities that attract a mix of industries like life science, green tech, fintech services are also much more resilient against economic downturns. But life science has been a really hot topic over the last few years.
Yes, and interestingly, science and tech hubs are still very important in today's world, despite the fact that we can connect with each other over the internet. Scientists and intellectuals are naturally attracted to and gravitate around specific hubs in the world. And it's interesting to think that many of these hubs started out hundreds of years ago. So I'm thinking of, in Cambridge with Isaac Newton in the 1600s, in Vienna with Johann Wolfgang Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and later Ernst Abbe and Carl Zeiss, in Heidelberg with Martin Luther, and in Paris with Louis Pasteur. These hubs may start with a focus on religion or philosophy or literature, but over the centuries they transform into science and technology hubs. You could almost call them our new religions, right? We think there is a bit of a mini-series in itself on the topic, so we'll be coming back to it from time to time to look at a few individual science and intellectual hubs. We might even get our CEO, Lawrence, to fund us to go to these science hubs and make a podcast from them. I like that.
I love that idea. And I've worked pretty intimately with quite a few different places around the world, not just Stockholm, such as Basel, Switzerland, and Greater Hamburg, and Liverpool. You and I, Rob, both worked on the marketing of the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, when they had to leave the UK due to that B word, Brexit. And what a great idea Brexit was by the Brits. Not. Exactly. But anyway, we helped on establishing the EMA in the Netherlands and helped put it on the map as a life sciences hub.
We did. That was fun. Anyway, let's spend a bit more time looking at the world's top life science hubs. And we've been debating this back and forth for a little while, but let's give our thoughts on this as we see it today, the places where biotech, pharma, innovation converge.
Our top 5.
Yes. Let's start with the obvious heavyweight, which we think is Boston, Cambridge, and Massachusetts, the United States. Boston's Kendall Square is often called the most innovative square mile on the planet. It's where MIT, Harvard, and the huge cluster of biotech firms sit practically on top of each other. It's home to Moderna, Novartis, and dozens of cutting-edge startups. The talent pool, the access to funding, and the academic firepower make it an R&D paradise.
Yep, place we've visited many times. Then, staying in the US, there's obviously the Bay Area, San Francisco and Silicon Valley. One of my favorite places
Me too.
on earth. We've both been there many times. We have opened actually our latest creative hub in Palo Alto.
Excellent choice, sir.
News just breaking. We both love Palo Alto, and I'm even seriously thinking about moving there.
Really?
Why not? The weather's better.
It is.
Anyway, but what makes it unique is, I think, the fusion of biotech, tech, and the funding and the VC. And then you've got the universities, UCSF, you've got Stanford, you've got Berkeley, and then companies like Genentech and all the AI now happening and machine learning horsepower from Silicon Valley, ideal for digital health and precision medicine.
Yeah, they're amazing. It actually puts the others a little bit in the shade with that technological advantage. Right. And if we hop across the Atlantic, the UK has its golden triangle. You've got London, Oxford, Cambridge. It's another powerhouse. It combines academic excellence with all those great universities, with big pharma like AstraZeneca, plus access to NHS data, the National Health Service data.
Which is key.
Gold for clinical research purposes.
Yeah. And then moving into Europe, we discussed this one, but Basel, Switzerland really stands out. Smaller in size, but has had a unique impact, and a place we know well. We've been working with them and the brand and their digital platforms for a number of years. It's home, obviously, to both Roche and Novartis, which is obviously key to that. And it's a magnet for talent from all over Europe. And the regulatory and IP environment there is as polished as a Swiss watch, which actually I got to tour when we were doing some work there. I got to tour a Swiss watch factory. They do check your pockets when you leave.
Oh, do
That's
they?
the only,
Shame.
only downside.
And rounding out our top 5 is the Stockholm Uppsala region, right here in Sweden. Maybe a quieter giant, but with very deep roots in science. I would contend that Uppsala is generally one of the world's great places of science. Uppsala University is the oldest in Scandinavia. It was founded in 1477, and it's still a major force in global life science research, which I would like to suggest actually took off with Carl Linnaeus. In fact, he was one of the reasons I first decided to visit Uppsala. I heard about him when I was growing up in Hong Kong, given the opportunity to come to Uppsala to see the home of Carl Linnaeus. He was also known as Carl von Linné.
Bit of branding.
Definitely, he royalized his name to von Linné.
Yeah.
He was a real Renaissance man, recognized in his time throughout Europe. So he was a living legend. The French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau sent him the message, "Tell him I know no greater man on earth."
He was Welsh.
He was. No wonder he had the ego the size of our planet.
Yeah.
And Johann Wolfgang von Goethe wrote after the Linné's death, "No wonder he, with the exception of William Shakespeare and Baruch Spinoza, I know no one among the no longer living who has influenced me more strongly." So his plant naming system of families, genera, and species is an ingenious solution which is still in use today. He was well ahead of his time. And did you know, Julian, that he even hinted at a theory of evolution a full century before Darwin?
That I did not know. Evolution. Well, as you know by my genome, which has been the subject of much debate, I'm part Neanderthal. So I think the evolution thing may have passed me by.
That may very well be the case. Nonetheless, as early as 1747, Carl Linnaeus wrote to a fellow scientist, Johann Gmelin, "Yet man does recognize himself as an animal. But I ask you and the whole world for a generic differentia between man and ape, which conforms to the principles of natural history. I certainly know of none. If I were to call man ape or vice versa, I should bring down all the theologians on my head. But perhaps I should still do it according to the rules of science." In that sense, Linnaeus felt the same sense of foreboding that Darwin did about speaking up about the suspicions of our common ancestry with apes and upsetting the religious order of the time.
So we just celebrated Valborg or Valpurgis Night, I think in English,
Yes.
in Uppsala, April 30th, longest day, or the last of April, we call it in Sweden, don't we? Last of
Yes.
April. A major event in Uppsala, the celebration of the arrival of spring, which pretty much doubles the city's population
Yeah, it's amazing.
for a day. And a lot of people in Uppsala actually act like lesser primates on Valborg. Maybe that's why Linnaeus first saw the similarity between apes and humans.
Well, the students started celebrating Valborg about 50 years ago in Uppsala,
Oh, okay.
but yeah, they do behave like apes, that's true. Then you've got this great people like Svante Arrhenius, the Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, who established the electrolytic theory of dissociation
Very, very important.
for the invention of batteries, so relevant today, and galvanizing metals. I once worked for his company, Kibo Lab, which he founded to import the chemicals to run his lab. Then there's the great Arne Tiselius, who won the Nobel Prize for electrophoresis. In the classic scientific accent, he is responsible for the discovery that started the company that you once worked for, Julian, Pharmacia Biotech, now called Cytiva.
Yep.
He was looking to perform electrophoresis to separate blood into its components, to produce the serum for making blood transfusions for soldiers during the Second World War. And being wartime, blood was in very short supply. So it was mixed with, of all things, sugar beet pulp to bulk it out. He intended to start the electrophoresis experiment, but before he left the lab, he actually forgot to switch on the electricity current, which is actually essential for an electrophoresis. So when he got back to the lab in the morning, he realized his mistake. But somehow the blood had managed to separate all the same. It was a perfect accidental discovery.
Accidental science.
Yeah. That's how he discovered the natural separating properties of dextran, which is the sugar contained in the sugar beet pulp. And dextran and its variants are still used today to purify all the biological medicines in the world. Insulin for diabetics, Herceptin for treating breast cancer, Botox for facial aesthetics, vaccines against viruses for all of us. So this is really amazing. No dextran, no modern pharmaceutical industry. It's as simple as that. So dextran's properties were a hugely important discovery for medicine.
That when you drive through southern Sweden, Skåne, you see all those fields of sugar beets.
Yeah.
That's where they're all coming up here.
Indeed.
And it's amazing how the past and the present link up like that. And that is so often what you find with place marketing. The past so often informs the present and the future.
Indeed. And there are many more scientific greats who came from Uppsala. There's Anders Ångström, who gave us the scientific unit for measuring light and molecules, or Tia Svedberg, who developed the ultracentrifuge. He was Arne Tiselius's PhD advisor and yet another Nobel Prize winner in chemistry. The list goes on and on. We really have to give some mention to Anders Celsius, who was born in Uppsala in 1701 and has spent most of his life then as professor of astronomy at Uppsala University. But we all know him for inventing the Celsius temperature scale. He also founded Sweden's first observatory in Uppsala in 1741. I've actually visited it.
And Celsius, the man who gave us logical temperature measurement. I've never figured out why Americans stick with the Fahrenheit scale, which is just so illogical. And Fahrenheit, I think, was a German, defined the freezing point of a brine mixture as 0 degrees and then 100 degrees as body temperature, and then boiling point of water is 212 degrees F. But I mean, how messy is that? And you can't really remember all that. So thank goodness our logical Swede Celsius brought decimal order to the world.
Indeed. And let's not get started on kilometers versus miles.
Oh, no, that I know a bit about, as I'm a bit of an amateur historian. It was the good old Romans who gave us the mile, the word mile. The word mile comes from the Latin mille paces, meaning 1,000 paces. And a Roman pace was about 5 Roman feet. So a Roman mile equaled about 5,000 Roman feet, roughly today 1,480 meters, a bit shorter than today's mile at 5,280 feet.
And then the Brits in the Middle Ages messed up the Roman
As
model
always.
by setting it to furlongs instead. And we get today's modern mile, which only a few countries use, such as the US or the UK. The rest of the world is civilized and uses kilometers. But you're off on a history tour now, Julian, I believe, to see and walk the largest Roman monument in the world, I believe.
I am indeed. Next week, in fact, I'm walking the 2,000-year-old Hadrian's Wall in the north of England, all 135 kilometres of it, or that's 84 miles for the UK and US listeners, which will take me 6 days, and I'm really looking forward to it. I've never walked that far in one stretch, so it'll be a bit ambitious. But we're getting distracted. Let's return to the main topic, Uppsala's brilliant scientist. And Uppsala is a place of science, and I'm kind of surprised. We must mention Dag Hammarskjöld.
Yeah, he's not a scientist, but
No.
he was an economist and widely regarded as one of the most effective and visionary leaders in the UN that the UN's ever had. He lived and studied in Uppsala. He actually lived in the castle. He came from a very prominent Swedish family, and his father was once Swedish Prime Minister, and he ended up being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize posthumously after his untimely and tragic death over the Congo in 1961. The only person to receive it after death, actually.
Well, you know, Uppsala has a really impressive history.
And yes, and Uppsala is not just rich in history, it's still very much at the cutting edge of biotech and modern science, molecular science today.
Okay, now I know you love Uppsala and it is a great place, but it's not got Stockholm's star power, which is anchored by the world-famous Karolinska Institute, which is not just a top medical university, but also awards the Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology. There's a real pedigree here, from Astra and Pharmacia to innovations like the pacemaker and the gamma knife. That legacy powers a vibrant startup scene in biotech, medtech, and digital health. And don't forget Sweden's digital edge and emerging companies such as, say, Nico Health, and the AI-powered preventative healthcare company offering a full-body diagnostic scan.
Fascinating company. And I've just signed up actually on the website. Go to nicohealth.com. It was co-founded by Spotify's Daniel Ek. He's keeping it in Sweden. And it utilizes advanced sensor technology and artificial intelligence to provide non-invasive health assessments aimed at early disease detection and prevention. So we're talking well care instead of sick care, which has to be the future of medicine. And this convergence of digital and health is truly fascinating.
I know they've now opened their second location in London. They've got 2 in London. So this thing is spreading.
Right, yeah.
And on top of all that, Stockholm's got world-class health registries again and a population that's open to sharing data. Ideal for AI-driven health solutions. Plus, you've got a government, the government is all in terms of strong funding, smart policy, and a national vision to be a global leader in precision medicine by 2030.
Yeah, you've got to hand it to the Swedish government. They're thinking really well here. I have to agree, Stockholm is not just a hub, it's a smart, connected launchpad for the future of life sciences. But Uppsala and Stockholm together, God, they make for a fantastic science hub. So we should actually pitch them together.
But importantly, I think we have to talk about them in the opposite order. Stockholm, Uppsala. And I'll tell you why. In fact, you know this. Let's say you go into a bar in New York.
Yeah.
And you say where you're from. What would you say?
I'm from Uppsala.
And what does the barman say?
Where's that?
And then what do you say?
Oh, it's a suburb of Stockholm.
Exactly. So the fact is, Stockholm is this star magnetic hub that you have to reference to sort of put where you're from on the map. And so I think we talk about Stockholm, Uppsala. I think that's the right way around.
Yeah, for branding purposes, for sure.
Yeah.
Very true. Anyway, let's talk a bit more about today's star scientist that we're featuring.
Yes.
Alfred Nobel, Stockholm's most famous son. So I would say he's the patron saint of moral dilemmas. Nobel was born in Stockholm in 1833 into a family of engineers and innovators. His dad, Emmanuel Nobel, was into explosives before it was even cool or remotely safe.
And a bit of a fun fact here, the family actually moved to Russia, and I think it was to do with money. They needed to move for financial reasons. When Alfred was young, because naturally, where else would you go to sell naval mines? But he got into private tutoring and in languages, literature and science. At 17, he was fluent in 5 languages.
Wow.
17, I think all I was fluent in was sort of dry humour and pulling wheelies on my motorbike.
You were a biker?
I was a biker.
Oh, you always managed to shock me. Anyway, Alfred was also fascinated by poetry, and he wanted actually to be a writer, but his father basically said, no son of mine is going to waste his life with verse when there are chemicals to blow things up with. So Alfred studied chemistry across Europe, especially focusing on explosives.
Which brings us to nitroglycerin, a highly unstable liquid that makes TNT look like a scented candle. But Alfred saw its potential for mining and construction, and after a few rather tragic accidents, including one that killed his younger brother, he found a way to stabilize it.
Right. He combined nitroglycerin with an inert, absorbent material called diatomaceous earth, basically the fossils of diatoms, and patented under the well-known name in 1867 as dynamite. What a great name, dynamite. It was safer to handle, relatively speaking, and 20 times more powerful than black powder.
And it just occurs to me, what a great brand name. Adding those 2 names
It's fantastic.
together is brilliant. I mean, you wouldn't think about it. And anyway, KABOOM, he was rich. Factories all over the world, piles of patents, more money than he could count, although he probably tried. But here's where the story gets a twist, and the important twist. In 1888, Alfred's brother Ludwig died, and a French newspaper got confused and published an obituary for Alfred Nobel instead.
And it was not flattering. The headline was, "The Merchant of Death is Dead." So the obituary condemned him for profiting from explosives and destruction. So imagine reading your own obituary and realizing you're the villain in your own life.
Right. Now, that's a brutal marketing and PR crisis if
It
there
is.
ever there was one, but it really shook Alfred. And maybe it got him thinking, how do I want to be remembered? For inventing dynamite or for something a bit less, let's say, deadly?
Yeah, with foresight. So in 1895, just a year before his actual death, Nobel rewrote his will. He left 94% of his fortune to establish 5 annual prizes: physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace. He wanted to reward those who conferred the greatest benefit to humankind. And interestingly, the Peace Prize was to be awarded in Oslo, in Norway, and not Stockholm, Sweden, like the other Nobel Prizes. Now, you've had something to do with the Nobel Peace Prize yourself, haven't you, Julian?
Yes, I was actually pulled in by the Norwegian Nobel Committee to work on the redesign of the Nobel Peace Prize concert identity and logotype, which was a lot of fun. And importantly, I got to attend the Peace Prize ceremony. I got to go to the famous room with all the pictures of the famous peace laureates, and that was just absolutely fantastic. And got to meet lots of cool stars in the after party of the concert. But most importantly, I took my mother along one year to the actual Peace Prize ceremony. And I'd never been able to explain to her what I did and what a marketing person does. But that was the one time she was really impressed with me.
Yeah.
She still didn't know what I did, but she was impressed.
Yeah, that's good. Your dear mum, Margaret. And I think for every person, it's really important that their mother kind of knows what they do.
Of course.
And in our world, it must be difficult for the previous generation to actually get their heads around what we do. So, why was the Peace Prize awarded in Oslo? It seems odd.
Yeah, well, the theory is, unlike Sweden, Norway didn't have a strong military tradition or colonial ambitions. Also, you've got to remember, Sweden and Norway were the same place when this happened. They didn't separate
It's
until
pre-1906.
1905. Yeah, and Norway may have seemed more neutral, peace-minded, and appropriate for a prize about diplomacy and conflict resolution. And Nobel himself had fairly complex political views and distrusted Swedish nationalism, militarism, and he also had some ties to some very influential Norwegian pacifists like the author Bjørnson, who likely influenced his thinking rather well.
So he made his fortune out of blowing things up, but he wanted to be remembered for progress.
Correct. And it worked. And if you just think about it today, the name Nobel doesn't make people think of detonations or dynamite. It makes us think of the globally recognized Nobel Prizes and people like Einstein, Malala, Mandela, basically the global hall of fame for people who actually have helped the world.
So let's not forget, Nobel's scientific contributions were genuine. You know, the stability and the transportability of dynamite revolutionized industry, making projects like the Panama Canal and railway tunnels actually possible.
True, and from a brand perspective, Alfred Nobel, I think, is a masterclass in legacy management. He didn't just change the narrative, he funded it as well.
Yeah, with compound interest, no less.
For sure.
His endowment still funds the prizes today. That's a very literal long-term impact.
So, what have we learned so far about what truly makes a world-class science hub? And I think here, firstly, you have to point out the big difference with the marketing of a place over, say, a product or a service. Marketing a place, nobody owns the place. Very few places are owned, like a brand is owned.
Yeah.
There is no brand owner in the case of a place. So that brings in this discussion about stakeholders. You've really got to engage stakeholders in the place, because it's their place, it's their city, it's where they live and work and go to university and everything else. So that becomes a really important part of making a place successful. I think history always plays a role. And obviously that starts with, in the science sense, having great academic institutions. And these provide the base of knowledge needed and the ecosystem for great ideas to grow that attracts great scientists. From great scientists, you get famous scientists that then help create the conditions for great science companies that act as a magnet for tomorrow's scientific talent. Then some of the other elements I'd add are extremely important to that list, which is things like accessibility, being able to get there. Nowadays, that's more important than ever. So having good accessibility, having a good sized population around, that's an advantage. And I said earlier, but stakeholders, how you deal with and manage stakeholders in the place. And I've actually written a chapter of a book on this topic called Rethinking Place Branding, and it deals specifically with managing stakeholders. And we'll put a note on that at the end of this, on the podcast. And something so many people, again, undervalue, but going back to our theory of the non-rational scientist, great culture. And there we're talking about things to see and do and learn from, and great food, great restaurants. We've never eaten badly in a great science club, have we, Rob?
Never. It seems to go hand in hand, food culture and science culture. So, interesting, you know, when I saw you place branding for the first time, I realized with these diverse stakeholders, nobody really owning the brand, I call place branding the extreme sports of marketing.
Yeah, that's a good way to think of it. It's a tough thing to do well, very tough. There is even a campaign afoot at the moment to rename Stockholm Arlanda Airport after good old Alfred. So Stockholm Alfred Nobel Airport. And I think he deserves that.
I think so. That'd be a really small move. I think, really small move.
Yep.
While we're on the topic of non-scientist icons, we mentioned Dag Hammarskjöld of Uppsala. I have to give an honourable mention to Ingmar Bergman, who the illustrious film and theatre director, who was born and raised in Uppsala and gave a face to Swedish angst, to Swedish melancholy, to Swedish nudity, and gave it all a global reputation. He was such a doer type and, you know, down in the dumps, but beautiful at it. I think Bergman would have gone on really well with Robert Smith of The Cure.
I think you're right.
There, now I put my beloved Uppsala on the map. So Uppsala, we've given you cred.
I think we've given you. Anyway, Rob, just finally, do you know what Stockholm Syndrome is?
Yes, I do actually. I think it's when a prisoner starts to feel, starts to go bonkers and starts to feel sort of allegiance to their captor.
Yeah.
It's pretty much what I feel like in this podcast room with you. It's actually named after a robbery that happened in Stockholm in 1973, when one of the bank clerks fell in love with one of the crooks. So, why do you ask?
It's actually, Stockholm Syndrome basically describes my life in Stockholm. I'm a willing captive, and I've fallen in love with this wonderful city, and I feel as passionately about it as you do, Uppsala. So if anyone listening gets a chance to visit, I really encourage it. Anyway, we are out of time now, and I hope you've enjoyed our romp through the story of Nobel and the scientific credentials of Stockholm and Uppsala as a great place of science, both today and tomorrow. We'll come back to this theme in the future, I'm sure, and look at some other places of science. But for now, it's goodbye from me.
And remember to stay innovative, stay curious, stay foolish. Goodbye. The Art of Marketing Science is produced by UpThereEverywhere.com. The next edition will be with you shortly.